serious. Currently, what is the greatest threat to humanity? Water security. And GT, water. I'm surprised this hasn't been mentioned more. Water is a basic need for survival and it's becoming a scarce resource. Companies are buying water rights and denying farmers and citizens access to it. I'm an Australian. Our river systems are being sucked dry by people and the changing climate. Water is a political issue. It's not just here, it's a global crisis. Water. Animal agriculture is a huge contributor as well. In Australia they're killing camels to save water, but it takes 1,800 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of beef. And Australia eats a lot of beef. The rapidly approaching threat of humanity returning to a pre-antibiotic era due to abusive use of antimicrobials coupled with a rapid reduction of discovery and a lack of currently approved alternative approaches. Phage therapy. People. https://www.ncbi.nl Monsieur. NIH. Gov. PMC. Articles. PMC 5547374. Kurzgesagt did a video on bacteriophages as well. Edit. Since y'all can chill about spelling, antibiotic-resistant bacteria is pretty scary stuff. Bacteriophages allow us to introduce ourselves. I worked with them quite a lot in college, so happy we're exploring them as an alternative. It seems as though bacteria that develop a resistance to antibiotics tend to be more vulnerable to phages. The ocean slowly dying. Once that ecosystem collapses, we won't be able to feed ourselves. Governments will crumble pretty quickly. No, this is much worse than you realize. 70% of the world's atmospheric O2 comes from phytoplankton. If those green phytoplankton blooms die out, we start to suffocate. As CO2 concentration increases, people get dumber. As people get dumber, things start falling apart. We're royally fucked. We won't even be able to think our way out of the situation. Herd mentality. It's a double-edged sword, but with the age of the internet it's gotten worse than better. Herd immunity, where groups of like-minded idiots can gather together to go against scientifically proven ideas, without repercussions. Fear not. There will be repercussions. Willful ignorance, the demonization of experts and academics to the extent that people are congratulating themselves for being uneducated. There is a cult of ignorance in the United States, and there has always been. The strain of anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread winding its way through our political and cultural life, nurtured by the false notion that democracy means that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. Isaac Asimov. It has brought our civilization to the brink of collapse. Now at a time of critical planetary emergency we need experts to be taken seriously, politicians to understand the situation, and implement policies that will actually have a significant effect, and everyone to understand the absolute need for real changes in order to avoid the worst of what is coming. We as a species have to decide now whether we do what is necessary to continue as a global civilization, or put the actual decision and difficult action off to a later time that will be far too late, ensuring misery, suffering, and death on a scale never seen before in human history. The only thing Asimov got wrong was limiting that statement to the US. It's pretty pervasive in Britain, too. I suspect that the internet, which was conceived of to share knowledge, has also been used to proliferate stupidity. The fact that people don't trust scientific evidence anymore. As a scientist, I want to agree with you, but the amount of utter garbage I read being portrayed as scientific fact these days, I can completely understand why so many people have no faith in the scientific community. What are some of the common ones? As far as rapid extinction level events, the three most destructive threats are: 1. Cosmic disruption, all unlikely, but could do anything from vaporize the planet to render half the world's population, crops and technology useless. Airborne, contagious, lethal virus, could come about at any time and, if it had an incubation period of 7 days, could spread to 6 continents within 24 hours before even being detected. We tend to presume that modern medicine can overcome or contain all threats to public health. This may not always be the case. When carried out to infinity, nature will get in some good hits on humanity. Let's not forget there are people who dedicated their lives to coming up with the most lethal, hybrid, biological threats known to man. Thus far, these threats have remained contained. Global thermonuclear war. We are past the era of duck and cover, but there are systems in place that would mean even an accidental nuclear launch or a rogue attack by a terrorist group that commandeered a remote missile launcher could start a chain reaction, because our command and control systems are obstinate, self-reliant and still on hair-trigger alert. If all warheads were used with mass casualties as the goal, half the world's population would die within hours. Many of the remaining half would likely die within the next decade due to radioactive fallout and a breakdown in food distribution systems. Everything described is unlikely, but we indeed have made enough warheads to decimate humanity if we wish. More gradual changes. 1. The end of fertility. There are an increasingly high number of men and women of good health who are otherwise unable to have children. Some argue this is a result of gradual increased exposure to radiation. If this trend continues at this pace, we may see an era where humanity is simply unable to have enough children to sustain itself. Weather or agricultural disruption, drastic changes to precipitation, pH levels, or amount of sunlight due to more or less cloud cover in specific regions could alter global food production networks such that we'd see mass starvation and perhaps wars over everything from water to arable land. Theo-social revolution. If global charismatic protected leader arose and gained worldwide followers, preaching that our Creator wanted us to either kill all non-believers or persuaded the population that suicide was essential to salvation, humanity could ultimately eliminate itself, we would have a probable Messiah. Artificial intelligence is also worth monitoring, but I have yet to see any evidence of a system that could achieve singularity or become self-aware, to the point of wanting to destroy humanity before humanity stopped it. And GT, the end of fertility. Interesting comment overall. I think this one is an easy fix though. Even today we have the technology to make all the babies we could ever need, and a lot of people choose to remain child-free compared to previous generations. Misinformation. This goes hand in hand with political polarization and echo chambers in my opinion. It's scary how easy it is to put out false and unverified info on the internet, and even scarier, that people would accept the info without double-checking, either to reinforce their beliefs, standing, or use it as a reason to despise the other side. Biodiversity loss. I think people underestimate the problem that biodiversity loss is. Climate change is a huge problem, but I think biodiversity loss is even more problematic. There is a total collapse of insects populations, and we begin to see a huge decline in bird populations. Other species will 100% be impacted, and I don't want to admit it, but it'll sooner or later impact food production. And that's where people will realize that hit the fan. OFC, if we manage to find new sources of oil so that we can attain +6 degrees Celsius by 2100, climate change will be a bigger problem this year, unless we mitigate it with a nuclear winter. And basically all our major problems can be summed by one word: greed. I have recently started going to a beekeeping school, and back in 1950 the average failure rate of a hive was 5%. As of 2019 the average failure rate is about 40%. That is absurd that nearly half of human-kept hives are failing. I was also told that most of the hives out in nature fail. It's crazy that we as humans know what we need to do exactly to keep bees, but still 40% of the hives we have die off. It's important to note that honeybees are a single species, and one not native to North America at that. There also seems to be a pretty solid consensus on the cause of colony collapse disorder: inbreeding. Domestic honeybees have been too intensely managed, and now the problems are starting to show. While honeybees are significant pollinators, they unfortunately also vastly overshadow native pollinators, which account for the other 80% of pollination services in North America. But they don't produce honey, so nobody cares about them, despite the fact that habitat fragmentation, pesticide use and competition from wild honeybees are causing them to decline at a faster rate than domestic honeybees, weaponizing bipartisan issues in every country, making everything a team sport, rather than a shade of gray. People would vote for the worst thing on earth just to be on the winning side. The average person has no understanding that there are more bots on the internet than people. That every interaction serves only to make them more pliable to the will of whoever pulls the strings that day. Antibiotic resistance. Poor critical thought skill and GT, ignorant individual and GT, hive mind and GT, idiotic society and GT, loss of freedom, starting with freedom of speech. Have you read Fahrenheit 451? I often revisit this old fave of mine. It's interesting to see that this book does not really depict a dire totalitarian regime that forbids and burns books. It's about a society that has become so ignorant, manipulated and stupid, that it's their very own citizens who start finding books offensive, and ask the gov to burn and forbid them this year. Of course, the gov obligs. Rings a bell? I always felt like Fahrenheit 451 was about an ignorant society, too occupied with burning offensive books and too focused on unimportant, to realize a war was happening. When the bombs finally fell, it was all too late. Habitat destruction. The fact that people idolize important people so much that they think those people can't commit any wrongs, and hating people groups so much they can't admit those people can do good things. Antibiotic resistance and companies not researching new antibiotics because it's nuclear war. No one takes it serious, and that's exactly why it's scary. Multiple treaties are cancelled or soon to be cancelled. New START, Treaty on Open Skies, etc. Privatization of our inner life and everyday mood by privatization of a global financial crisis much worse than 2008, because this time it will hit China also, and of course the impending environmental cumber of the edge of volcano on Canary Islands is probably the most pressing threat that nobody talks about. We don't talk about it, but an eruption and the subsequent collapse of the volcano into the ocean would, according to some scientific studies, generate a mega tsunami that would wipe out most cities on the Atlantic coast. Coronal mass ejections striking the Earth. I think a lot of our infrastructure isn't designed to handle it, and even just a few days of power and internet going out across the civilized world could wreck us as a society. Climate change. It's ironic that this is so low. Most of the things higher up on the list of functions, manifestations or causes